So we've got a documentary that came out, the Money Electric by an HBO documentary producer. Lucas, you had a chance to catch part of it. I know Rusty and I both watched the whole thing. I thought it was an interesting documentary. I thought it gave a lot of background into Bitcoin for somebody that didn't know much about it. I felt like it did pretty well there. But as far as the conclusion of who they chose to be Satoshi, I thought that probably incorrect. And I believe the rest of the internet is also of the same conclusion that they definitely got the wrong guy.
You know, the look the Mona Lisa smirk on Benjamin Franklin's mouth pretty much sums up my feelings about any discussion of who is Satoshi. And it's a fun
Yeah,
game to
little bit of snark. Yeah, what do you mean?
little bit of snark, a little bit of I mean, I watch General Hospital, but I don't want to admit it. I say that because it's ironic that we are so concerned about who is Satoshi when it's not in the best interest of Satoshi to be known. It was part of the success of Bitcoin against some of the other competitors, but part of it is in the technical underpinnings of Bitcoin, but a lot of it, in my opinion, has to do with the anonymity of Satoshi and this Spartacus, this this Spartacan notion of anyone could be Satoshi, anyone could aspire to be nobility. Uh, that that aspect of it is to me so much more interesting. Um,
Well, they gave kind of two answers on that, and I felt like they were contradictory even within the documentary. The first time they said, Adam Back said, it's actually fairly difficult to put all this together. And then later they said, well, there was hundreds or thousands of people who potentially could have done this. And that to me seemed like they were playing both sides and not really taking a firm stance on, was this really something innovative? And I don't feel like the documentarist had a firm sense of which way it was. And I think that might just be due to him not really understanding the technical underpinnings of what Bitcoin is. Like, even though he says he spent a lot of time learning about it and whatever, but definitely not a programmer, not someone who's developed smart contract, not worked on the code directly, and so has to take a lot of other people's opinions for it, is really just listening to other people give commentary.
the search for competent devs in crypto today might speak to how rare it was for someone to be able to build or create Bitcoin. But I think what they were getting at was maybe an understanding of the excitement about the possibilities uh, of electronic cash, of using the internet to subvert and get around banks. And they did mention some of the other. They mentioned eGold. It's always one that I can't remember. A symbol X, a symbol. And anyway, there had been a lot of talk and a lot of excitement uh, about using the internet to get around the control of banks, the control of money transmission, and PayPal kind of tackled it in its own way in tackling the settlement window, but there was, I don't know, that there was a lot of excitement about it, and so I did appreciate that. I also appreciated them getting into who Adam Back is. I think he is, telling some of the history and the narrative of the people who contributed to it is maybe as important. But there's also something greater that's going on here. I mean, Bitcoin is always about something larger. It's about the financial system. It's about power. It's about who's in control. And when I saw that this documentary was coming out, I said, "Well, there must be a reason." Like every time there's a lot of focus and excitement, this effervescence that is exploding in the Bitcoin community world and the crypto world, I usually sort of like pull my head up and look around. And the Supreme Court just cleared the path for the sale of the Silk Road Bitcoin. And to me, this there was probably the idea or the notion of some sort of crypto of some crypto documentary or some television projects that were going to broach it, and they maybe had been shelved, maybe they were working on them, but I also think, we've had Trump and Vance that are talking about a strategic Bitcoin reserve. We know that the Democrats are not excited about this. And so I had every expectation that they were doing everything possible to get that dirty money out of the system and to remove from the possibility of a new administration.
Well, your favorite topic came up in the documentary. I don't know if you got quite that far, but they talked extensively about CBDCs and how that might come into play.
No, oh, I didn't get into that, but um, darn it, I wish that I'd gotten through it. I had a busy morning here. Um, Interesting that they did bring up CBDCs because there's because it's there's to me there's a big difference between libertarians and anarchists, and a lot of the fervor and those who were initially drawn to Bitcoin were there was maybe no distinction between the goals and an understanding of the abuse that was being wrought upon American citizens and the world in the hidden inflation of the supply of the dollar. But at some point, I don't necessarily believe in anarchy, and I think that something that's integral to anarchy is privacy. And so while I do believe in authenticity and I believe in open networks and I believe in speech and more speech, I have I have stepped back my my belief in privacy, and and I think that's maybe the distinction between what a lot of orange pilled Bitcoin maxis are looking for, and what a CBDC might offer in rules that are written into a CBDC, limiting or standardizing the amount of inflation of the supply.
So they definitely talked about, you know, CBDCs that either were being experimented by the US government, by China. So these things came up. I think it was kind of right in the middle of the overall discussion documentary where they were showing the progression. It was like, oh, okay, here's Bitcoin, then Ethereum. What else can be done with this kind of technology? I thought it really did a good job of showing different camps. You know, it represented the block size war pretty well. I think it showed some of the players that were involved, from Roger Ver to Craig Mashinsky that was doing Celsius. You know, it did a pretty good job of documenting some of the highlight points of what has happened in the world of crypto and Bitcoin, and where Bitcoin has a particular place. But I think that the place that it really fell down and didn't do a good job on at all was talking about how did we even get to the point where Bitcoin could be created. Definitely built on top of other stuff. And they said, well, there was this other thing that was happening at the time, and there was Hashcash. But I don't think they really got deep into the subject of what were the technological precursors that were required to get to Bitcoin, and how did that ground the person who created it, because you needed to have a really sufficient background in a bunch of different technologies that were somewhat cutting edge or that were coming out interactively as a result of things that were happening in the culture at the time. You know, this whole rise of peer-to-peer file sharing and what was going on with Napster and different types of music sharing stuff that I don't think they did a good job of representing, because that peer-to-peer stuff is what was needed before you could even contemplate a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. You had to have those underpinnings, and I don't think they really got into that in a way that grounded Bitcoin as a technology that built on top of that stuff.
It's true, but it's incredibly hard. There are so many things that are going on, and it's a trip to see some of the footage and to be taken back to that era. But I think that either telling it from a peer-to-peer narrative or from a banking decentralization narrative are, you know, have to be separated in order to track those threads, because otherwise the story gets too convoluted. I Again, I think the purpose of the documentary was to drum up attention to Bitcoin, to try to sort of tell the story of it, and to prep the broad viewing audience of HBO in America and the world for an upcoming sale of Bitcoin. So I don't know. I would love it if they told it, but I did appreciate. I thought it was a pretty smooth telling. I appreciated some of the Roger Ver you mentioned, Gavin Andresen. I was just wondering the other day whatever happened to Gavin Andresen, and so I don't know. There was a lot going on there. I didn't the block size wars. I don't know. Getting into that aspect of it, they talk about the limited supply, and I think that is another fascinating facet of the growth or the changes in the concept of Bitcoin. And whenever I first saw, I didn't understand when I first heard of Bitcoin that there was going to be a limited supply. The things that were told to me or that were discussed amongst people who were interested and excited about it early on were the some of the technical problems that were solved, and nobody bothered to think or ask about this notion of supply, because the other decentralized electronic currencies had some sort of notion of something physically kept somewhere that were backing them up. But it's interesting to me today that there's, I had not heard originally of a 21 million supply cap, but when that happened, I thought about it a while, and I said, well, there's two sides to infinity. One goes up and one goes down. And it's interesting that they've been broken into Satoshi since then. And will they be broken again, or will the supply be increased?
That was another thing that stood out to me in the documentary that they're talking about, Lucas, is they were mentioning the Bitcoin mining and how, the Bitcoin mining has a halving every 4 years, and that, it was built into it that the halving would continue. I think it said until 2140, when basically the mining would no longer would mine any Bitcoin. And that's when you'd reach a total limit of Bitcoin. And so that's a long ways in the future. And I was looking at, you think about in the beginning, they were mining a lot of Bitcoin per block. And now after the halvings, there's the amounts that they mine are so little, but even then the amount of Bitcoin could possibly be so high that even that little amount of Bitcoin could still be substantial when you're able to mine it.
Yeah, the halvening, or the increasingly diminishing, isn't that a great phrase? The increasingly diminishing rewards for miners was another is part of the success of it. But when I first saw of the 21 million cap of Bitcoin, I was maybe a little bit pissed, because I was like, oh, if I had known that, if I had known that. But later, I thought it was absolutely brilliant in that it's set, or it gave this notion of a peer-to-peer money system. It gave us a measuring stick against the inflation of the dollar. And so for the longest time, I thought afterwards, when I would think of Bitcoin versus especially the dollar, You know, that like it, we say fiat, but in reality, when the dollar is being used by the rest of the world, the other currencies of the world were being measured against the dollar, but there was nothing to measure the dollar against. And so it could be stretched and stretched and stretched. And now we see it stretched at billions of dollars at a time. You know, like, oh, we're just going to magically create billions of dollars by selling treasuries to Tether, or whomever it was before. I think one of the greatest things that Bitcoin has done is to give us a measuring stick to begin to understand that inflation was not, in reality, is not at the price level, but at the supply level. And it gave us an ability to see how that supply was being stretched.
Another good thing I thought the documentary went over was it was talking about how, the US did the bailout of the banks, and how it would just, when things got in trouble with the banks, they say they were going to magically create another $1 trillion or just create more money to help bail out these banks and just create more money to solve the problem of, what was actually happening.
Yeah, and I just was recently pulling in thinking about this documentary coming out, because there was a little bit of fervor. I went to Wikipedia's days of history and calendar, and was looking back at that October, and Bitcoin was released, or the white paper was dropped. The Bitcoin had been you could download it and mine it for a couple of months leading into that, but the white paper is dropped right on the heels of the bailout, $700 billion, and some of the Federal Reserve programs that went to not just banks, but also the car manufacturing companies. Grant, what have you pulled up here on this, on Facebook of all things?
Well, there's this. Yeah, exactly. Why am I looking at Facebook? Because this guy posted the earliest versions of the Bitcoin source code here. So he says he was able to go retrieve it from SourceForge and say, here's the earliest known copy. All of this attributed to Satoshi with his personal notations in the code.
Wow, I would have thought this would have been more. Yeah, a first edition is quite a thing. I would have thought this would have been more replete throughout the Bitcoin maxi world. Have you were aware of this before, I guess? Have you looked through it?
No, I just went looking for this, like, as a result of, because one of the things that stood out to me from the documentary, where they talk about the supposed creator of Bitcoin, and that he knew C++, and therefore, oh, it must have been this 15-year-old kid that did it. And so it got me thinking, maybe I should take a look at this. I've done a fair amount of C++ programming, and I know how hard it is to get into this particular language, and how approachable could it be at 15, right? Could you actually write this kind of code? One of the things that sticks out to me from looking at this code is something called const correctness. If you note, and it probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you, but I'll try to point a little bit of this out, is littered throughout this code is this keyword right here. And that's known as const correctness. And this, I mean, you could easily write this without putting this word const here, and it would function pretty much the same way. But what this does is it says there's a certain type of safety associated with it. So the use of this, and the very sophisticated use of Boost at this time, like Boost, I don't know, was a fairly sophisticated C++ programming construct. So using the Boost libraries was, I think it would have been a pretty big deal that it had been used at this point. I wanted to do a little bit more sleuthing about that. I didn't take a minute yet to try to exactly ground myself into what your Boost got to be a big thing. But I remember when we first started working with Boost, that it was a huge thing, and being able to use managed pointers and whatever in C++. So this is fairly sophisticated C++, and I think you'd have had to have had some grounding to be able to write this kind of stuff, because you don't just fall out of bed and start writing great C++ code. This is a tough language, and there's a lot of nuance, and just even this early version of Bitcoin. I'd never really gone and tried to intimately look at the first versions. That's why I pulled it up, because I was kind of curious. I knew SourceForge would have been the right repository at the time where people would have put this stuff. So I just searched for Bitcoin Core SourceForge, and I came up with this James Blasco post on Facebook from 2 years ago.
When you think about the notions of, was this a young 15-year-old or was this an older person? I mean, to me, I always like leaned towards older, because in thinking about I don't know, the people's understanding of money, of government, there's a hot and burning like passion in young, especially men, with regards to like T.E. Lawrence, libertarianism, but this seemed to be a much more intentional. I don't know. I always thought that if there is a Satoshi, that he was in his 50s, that he had some sort of background in coding, that he was coming from he was coming to electronic money from an understanding of banking and finance, not from like an excitement about peer-to-peer networking.
Those are a lot of really good points you guys mentioned. And it got me to thinking, they mentioned in the documentary that he was a younger, Peter Todd, the supposed person of Satoshi, was younger when the Bitcoin was created, and they knew C++. And it reminded me of, when I was in junior high and high school, I kind of got into computers myself, and I started programming C and C++. And I was thinking, how much would you really have to know to be able to create so much of this programming? And looking through it, I think Grant is right. It's a lot higher level of degree of the C++ programming than you would just know in a basic understanding of the language. Like, I went through 4 years of programming in high school, and then I had to be bused to the college when I was in 11th grade to go to a college programming class when I was in school. And even then, in the programming class in college, they weren't really getting into something that was this detailed. And yeah, it was definitely, I think that it'd be a lot harder to try to produce this at a younger age, as Lucas was saying.
Well, and I've not like picked through the communications of Satoshi, but it's my understanding that at some point he references the Hunt brothers. And are y'all familiar with the Hunt brothers and their attempt to corner the silver market in the 70s?
I am not. I don't know if Grant is know about them, the Hunt brothers.
Yeah, Grant probably.
Yeah, I've heard of such things, the cornering the silver market. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I just bring it up because I was raised in a libertarian household, and the Hunt brothers were revered by my older uncles, and they would speak. I mean, if we had if some people have pictures of presidents on the wall, in two of my uncles' homes, they would have had pictures of the Hunt brothers. They were so absolutely revered in their antics with the silver market. And I think that there was an older generation than us. The Hunt brothers were the Satoshi of an older generation in some way. And so that Satoshi, or whoever was emailing under that pseudonym, was talking about the Hunt brothers or mentioned them. It says to me that they're a bit of an older generation, a Gen Xer at least. What do you got here, Grant?
Well, I thought I'd pull up who was the favored person, which was Len Sassaman, and they never mentioned any of the lead up of what was really going on at the time, or where these early ideas that resolved to Bitcoin were presented, because this all had a lot to do with what Bram Cohen was doing with CodeCon and some of these other conferences that were happening. So these conferences that were being organized, this is where a lot of these ideas got presented. And so this idea that Bitcoin sort of came out of nowhere, I just, that doesn't seem the way that I understand how history played out. That really there were a lot of ideas that were coalescing into the creation of Bitcoin, and that this was being worked on, maybe by a group of people that came together to build this thing. And that's why I think sometimes when Adam Back is asked questions, he kind of has this look in his face, because I feel like he knows some stuff that he's definitely not talking about, that he probably knew a lot more than he let on in the documentary. And even of the emails that he released recently, that they were talking about those ones. I don't know if you got to that point in the documentary, Lucas, but there's this email exchange that happened between Adam Back and Satoshi from the mailing address where he originally was doing a bunch of stuff, and he had held those back until the Craig Wright trial. And that was one of the ways that it became obvious that Craig Wright was not Satoshi. He didn't have intimate knowledge of a bunch of details of the code. He didn't get a bunch of stuff right. And sort of, if you dig through what was discussed in that case where they determined that Craig Wright was not Satoshi, I think that was one of the things that precipitated the release of those emails.
I did get to that part of the documentary, and I thought it interesting, and it put me in a mind of, I do appreciate some of the, he said the word netiquette, which I haven't heard in a long time too. I do appreciate netiquette, and he said it's polite. I think it might also be a question of legality. The sender of an email owns that email, and I also think that's important for us to think about, and maybe people who were coming to internet communication were leaning on older notions and understandings of communication. But in literature, it certainly occurs all the time. Famous writers, J.D. Salinger, Sylvia Plath, they write letters, and people prize those letters. But some authors, like once famous, and once their writing is a valuable thing, they send out letters to everybody they've written letters to and say, send back my letters. Those are actually mine. I want to put those in my archive, or I want people to still be charmed by the opus of work that I've created, and not be able to look under the hood. So it put me in mind of that. But are these Adam Back's emails, or are these just his to the?
These are some other emails. What I did was I pulled up the Craig Wright trial announcement, just because this was in the documentary, so it's like kind of just creeping up on some of the stuff that was in there. And these never before seen emails with Marty Malmy, and then I know that the Adam Back ones got released as well, so I was maybe going to dig those up and put those in the comments for the show today. So if people wanted to go look up this stuff a little bit more, might not have known that these things got released as a result of the trial. So that's what I was pulling up, was just looking through some of these things.
Well, and again, you said that it seemed as if Adam Back was a bit mum about everything that he knows. I'm sure that's true. but again, I don't think that the documentary was actually about who is Satoshi. In fact, I think that maybe in part is why they went uh, with the with the selection that they made. But I do think that Adam Back is very interested in promoting the understanding of of what was happening. But
Well, and just kind of look at what's being said in this email here. I'm not trying to laser in necessarily, but it's interesting to see that Satoshi claims he's a good coder. See that? That's kind of interesting.
Well, they were.
And that somewhat comports with what I was looking through in some of that C++ code, because I mean some of that is advanced const correctness stuff that a novice C++ programmer wouldn't even think about trying to do to get that stuff right, because it causes insidious bugs if you don't get it right. But I mean, it doesn't functionally improve your code necessarily to have that correct. It just says that certain things shouldn't be able to be changed in the code, and that would give an indication to the program that you've made a mistake if you're trying to change something that you've marked constant. So if you say something is const, then it's not supposed to be changed later in the program. And so it gives you certain types of warnings and error messages if you do something that would not align with that. So it's not the kind of a thing that a novice C++ programmer would go out of their way to make sure that they get right. That's something that you would have needed to have learned through battle-hardened C++ programming. So if I were to look at this code and say, what's the relative level of C++ maturity, that would give a strong indication of how long someone had been programming, because it takes time to acquire that sort of skill set in C++. I mean, we're talking 2009, 2010 here when this work was being, well, even before that, 2008, 2009. So, this isn't where you had generative whatever, and we didn't have super substantive types of lexical processors and whatnot to give you firm feedback on how you were doing this. These tools were less well refined at that point.
And when you are looking at his knowledge of C++, are you thinking maybe in your mind like this is a paradigm, somebody who had had a career in coding in C++ and doing some sort of standard software development for God knows what, maybe Quicken or Intuit or something that's in the financial realm, but knew of peer-to-peer networking and this drive for electronic money, and decided to take a crack at solving that problem?
I mean, you had to have deep understanding of how a variety of different technologies worked and bring them all together. I mean, think about all the different things that you had to get right to make this work. You had to have deep knowledge of cryptography and digital signatures. You had to be able to string that together into a coherent whole, building on top of existing papers that had been written. You had to know that those papers had been written and have read and understood them. Then you had to synthesize that together with technologies like a peer-to-peer system like BitTorrent and be inspired by how BitTorrent worked. It's just, I think Adam Back said it well in the documentary, where he's like, anybody could have done this, but it's actually fairly difficult to make it all work together and release it in a way that it's functional. And it's one thing to have the ideas, but it's another thing to release it as a coherent whole, as a releasable software that somebody else can run on their machine and have it actually function correctly. It's a lot.
You mentioned Len Sassaman earlier, and I was listening to one of his DEF CON, a talk he was giving at DEF CON about remailers, and he had been engaged. He had been leading a remailer system called Mixmaster, and it was interesting to me that in that discussion there was there's a portion in it which he and the other panelists talk about the problem that they're facing with getting people to host nodes, and how There was only
Is it this one right here? Is this one?
no. It was DEFCON 11.
DEFCON 11.
Ooh, you know what? I'm gonna have to watch this one too. But in DEFCON 11, in when they're having the discussion, they say there's only 30. You know, they're calling out to the crowd and saying, please, you know, we need people to be hosting these remailers, and these remailers are offering anonymity and email, and they have a side discussion in which they say, you know, like, why can't we get more people to host it? And essentially it's because spam is an issue. If they're providing anonymity, spam becomes an issue. And they go, you can see them thinking about how do we I guess leaning towards Adam Back's like cash notions of how do we raise the cost of traffic.
See, the thing about programming is it's a lot like writing. You have to get exposed to certain types of idioms and ways that you say things, right? Like there's a way to refer to writing in a language that is native to the language. So oftentimes there's a word associated with that. So if you're writing in Python, you can write Python that looks like C++, or you can write Python that looks like C. But if you write Python in the way that people accept Python to be the right way to write Python, then sometimes it's referred to as Pythonic or something along those lines. And so you pick up the little idiomatic ways that are the correct ways to do things in that language. And each language has its own particular vernacular and syntax structure. It's more like writing a book or in any language than you would anticipate. So a lot of people think, well, programming, it's all about math, but a lot of it has to do with style, syntax, like writing it in a way that other people can read it and understand it. There's a lot to programming that goes along those lines. And so if you look at the code that exists, there's likely stuff in there that if you would look at it, you'd say you would have had to have been exposed to a certain type of code base to have ever even thought that you should write that line of code like that. And there's probably a way to, you know, with big data to really get to the bottom of who Satoshi is just by looking at some of these early commits and saying, who could have possibly written some code that looks like this, and what other, you know, public code that we could look at that might lend us to understanding that this was something that came from a particular individual. I think that exercise could be completed, and probably you could pin down who Satoshi is just based on the style of writing, the way that he wrote, certain words that he used. And the documentary went into some of this where he said, hey, he was using, I don't know, British English spellings in some places and was using particular phrases or words in where he would communicate an email that likely would either have to be very synthetically used or to try to conceal his identity, or he was just using the way that he naturally spoke, and it would probably say, well, it has to be somebody that was in a particular place. I mean, even the chancellor on the brink of second bailout, that's from the London Times. I mean, why would someone be reading that particular newspaper? You know, it's things like that you could probably start to laser in on to get clues as to who it might be. And I think about those guys that do the geoguessing. Have you ever watched videos of people doing that?
No, I don't know what geoguessing is.
Geoguessing is where you give someone a random picture and you say, where is this on the planet?
Oh, I participate in that. I used to in Reddit threads.
So that kind of a thing, right? So you look at a picture and you say, oh, well, I see a little plant here, and oh, this street sign, that's Southern Australia, so it's got to be somewhere around here. And then they take a few clues, laser in, and then through a series of searches, find out the right spot, and then say, this is exactly where this is at. And then you get a score or win the prize or whatever. That same kind of analysis could probably be applied to everything that Satoshi ever was attributed to have written, and say, were these all of the same authorship, right? Is there any evidence that multiple people had control of the email, right? Are there inconsistencies in language, or is there a way that it was written that was inconsistent, that was posted somewhere at some point, and doing that sort of analysis, and then doing an analysis of all the code that was attributed to Satoshi, and then saying, okay, of all the other people who we think are in the locus of those who could possibly be this person, let's go look at all the public work that they've ever published and see if there are any common idioms, paradigms that were in the Bitcoin code that could be attributed to this person. And I think if you were to do that kind of an exercise, you could probably figure out who this person was. And I'm a little surprised that this sort of an effort hasn't actually taken place, because it seems to me like one of the very real ways to figure out who this person is, because it's really hard to consistently cover your tracks, I think. I mean, I would imagine it'd have to be very difficult to consistently cover your tracks and not make little mistakes or slip up if you're not speaking with your normal voice. Because again, this was all before we had generative chat GPT and this kind of stuff. So you can't easily just have something written for you. You have to write it yourself in this era, in this time and place. So it's been pretty hard to consistently write out of character. Can you imagine? I mean, like if you were trying to conceal your identity and not write the way you normally are, you'd have to be writing in character all the time. That seems pretty hard, as well as being a great coder. I mean, can you imagine? That sounds really, really tall order to me.
Well, and I think you're 100% right, and it is hard to cover your tracks. There's all of
And never make a mistake, never slip, never fail to use a VPN, never fail to conceal your IP address, never fail to say the wrong thing at the wrong point when you're drunk or whatever. Like, it's just, humans are fallible. Like, can you imagine over a period of years, like consistently concealing your identity and never telling anybody what you were doing, and also keeping your code a secret? And I don't know, that's really hard to contemplate.
I think our contribution to the discovery of Satoshi is to pinpoint that he was a teetotaler. No, I've often wondered if Satoshi was British, English, or just an Anglophile, and but that goes to, he could be British or English, and there's talk about the times in which he was often posting, lining up with times of productivity on the island of Britain.
Well, one thing I noted right away, right, when I was reading some of the emails, is that he used double space after the period.
Oh, is double space American and not British, or what? Or are you just speaking to the era? Because I learned
it's like a thing, right? I mean, why do you double space after a period? That was something that we did.
Because typewriters.
Yes, I mean, it's something when you were writing, right? They told you to do this kind of stuff so that your paper would have a certain type of formatting, and it's a hard habit to break. I mean, only people of a certain era would have been doing that, because it would have been just burned into your psyche that this is what you do. I mean, I used to do that, and I had to break myself of doing that. And sometimes I catch people that I'm interacting with, and I'm like, "Oh, you have double space," and I go through and I clear it out of their writing, because like, we don't do this. Like, you don't double space after a period, but it's right there in the email. It's like he's double spacing after periods.
Great catch. Yes, I think this also speaks to he wasn't a 15-year-old. He was a Gen Xer at the very least.
Well, there's little clues and hints in all this stuff. That's why I'm saying there likely could be some amount of this that you could go through and do and say, who would have been trained to do a particular thing? Who would have had the knowledge to write a particular piece of code? Is this code all authored by the same person? And this is almost the kind of stuff that an AI would probably do a pretty good job of doing, honestly.
Well, maybe it does it, but I kind of prefer my Satoshi anonymous. So
I guess I would make the strong assertion that if the world really wanted to know who this person was and dox this person, that it could be done. And that is what makes me think it's someone who's dead. Because if it was someone who was alive, probably would have already been identified, found out, and sequestered away.
Well, they did a great job of concealing their identity, and it adds to the mystique.
It goes to that old phraseology. how can two people keep a secret? Well, the only way is if one of them's dead. It's the only way for Satoshi not to be doxxed and out there and having to do stuff is because it's probably no longer living.
Well, I can't keep any secrets. I was raised on General Hospital and party line telephone. So I listen in on phone conversations. I think that adds to the fun of life. Well, a fun conversation about Satoshi. I don't have anything else that comes to mind. As I do have a question for you actually, as you're talking about this double space. Did you learn to type on a typewriter or a computer, a word processor?
I used both when I was younger because I grew up in a place that had computers, but we also had to learn how to use those. And I definitely had dot matrix printers and modems and all this kind of stuff. So I grew up in the first digital age, but I crossed the boundary. And some people say that was one of the most privileged generations because you experienced both worlds. Like people who are solidly Gen X only lived in an analog world. They never learned digital. And so they grew up in the old world, but there was a very specific small generation that transitioned Gen X and millennial and actually experienced both. I experienced both. I remember the world purely analog. I remember the transition to digital, and I had to live in both worlds. And I have typed on typewriters, and I've also used word processors and dot matrix printers. So,
you mentioned dot matrix printers, and it puts a huge smile on my face. I opened up a box.
well, I remember those reams of paper that had the little holes on the
Yes.
side.
Oh, you're gonna love this. So I opened up a closet and there was a pile of boxes, and I was going through all these boxes, a bunch of old documents and stuff, while cleaning them out. And I got to the bottom box, and it was a fresh box of dot matrix paper. So
Wow.
I am the lucky owner of an entire box of dot matrix paper, and I've got some old dot matrix printers, and I immediately wanted to go plug it in and print it off for that sound. Like maybe print off some like a 40-foot banner, because remember the banners that we could make because they went sideways.
Definitely. Print shop. He would make a banner, like a happy birthday banner. And it was such a huge deal because, wow, we can print a banner. It can be multiple pages and there can be an H on this one page. Yes, I remember that. The other thing I remember too, like when I was growing up, we had overhead projectors, with like cellulose slides. And the other thing we had was mimeographed reproductions for worksheets. Did you have mimeograph?
Oh yes, and when you say overhead projectors, it immediately takes me to fourth grade, and one of my fourth grade teachers like getting very stern with me because I put a ruler through the fan of the overhead projector and I broke the fan. That was the greatest shame of my fourth grade year.
Yep, they would wheel in the media center cart.
Good times.
Anyway, how does all that play in? Because there's certain little things you could pick up on that the average person looking at it today wouldn't really ring a bell. Wouldn't be like, oh, why is there two spaces? Why are they saying things the way they're saying it? What indications of what was being said and how it was being said that would give you an indication of who it is and how old that person would probably be, right? If you're 15 and you've never had to write on a typewriter, why would you double space your emails? Little things like that just wouldn't make any sense for a certain person of a certain age.
Maybe a one last disclosure and admission. I have to do search and replace to remove the double spaces that I put in my documents now when I get done with them. So, oops.
You do it ex post facto after the fact?
I mean, I can't. If I'm just like typing along, it is beaten into me like by not by a person, but by the immutability of typewriters. People don't understand the terror of a world without a backspace key.
Yeah, it's like I remember you're typing on a typewriter and you bang bang hit the hit the space key. As you're
You know,
done
I
with the
was
thought, move the key head forward.
Well, I was also I was transcribing recently some typed documents from the 70s, and it was interesting to look at them and to see that somebody didn't have very strong fingers, and characters like the W, which by the way, when I first learned typing, I also learned how to type Dvorak, which I don't think I can remember how to type with it now, but that when I was 12 years old, I was taught how to type Dvorak.
I had someone that was good with that keyboard, and the thing that was most striking about it was how much it shut down collaboration. Like even if it's a better keyboard, right? Even if you're faster with it, oftentimes what would happen during whatever era, you know, when we didn't all work from home and we weren't isolated onto specific workspaces where we couldn't easily collaborate with another person, is you would go and sit next to a person, or you would take over their keyboard and you would type some stuff while you were sitting there next to them. And if they were using Dvorak and you didn't know Dvorak, you were suddenly not able to work with their computer. And so you'd have to go into the settings and switch off Dvorak. And then when they wanted to use the keyboard, they'd have to turn it back on. And it just really caused collaboration to break down. So most people that I know that learned Dvorak quickly abandoned it because they couldn't collaboratively work in an office environment because not enough people knew how to type on it. And so it meant that your computer was unusable by somebody else if they wanted to jump on there and type something out for you.
You know, you nailed it on the head. The reason I learned Dvorak was because I wanted to use a Mac 2FX. It was the fanciest computer, but the person who sat at that computer most of the time was adamant about his Dvorak keyboard. So I got tired of switching it back and forth. In fact, I think I got in trouble for not switching it back after using it. It's like car seats. And so I just, because the other thing you couldn't do was, was like I didn't necessarily have the keys memorized on a QWERTY at that point. So anyway, um, it is fun. It was fun to look at typewritten documents and see that there was also sort of this latent. You could see different people who were typing this document at different portions of the document because their fingers weren't so strong. So more digital fingerprints.
Well, I don't know that I've got anything else for today. Anything else you wanted to talk about before we wrap it?
Oh, let's keep our eye out for an imminent sale of Bitcoin coming from the federal government. That's what I'd wrap it with.
I hope they don't.
Maybe they'll just sell it to Germany.
All right, we'll talk to you tomorrow.